morning and welcome to Rising. We have maybe the best show ever for you today. Let's see if we can live up to that. Hello, Brianna.
Hello, Robby. I'm ready to try. Well, on Wednesday, the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic held a hearing to investigate the origins of COVID-19. The hearing largely grappled with between two hypotheses of how the pandemic began, through a natural spillover event or an accidental lab leak. Witnesses who testified included the Republican invitees, Jamie Metzl, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, an international affairs think tank based in Washington, D.C., Dr. Robert Redfield, former director of the CDC, of course, and Nicholas Wade, former science editor for the New York Times. All three of those witnesses have supported the lab leak hypothesis. The Democrats invited one witness, Paul Auwaerter, the clinical director of the Division of Infectious Diseases at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Dr. Auwaerter is more favorable toward the zoonotic origin of the disease. We gave our initial reaction to some of the news out of the hearing yesterday, so check that out if you missed it.
Here to discuss key takeaways from the hearing is Katherine Eban, contributing editor at Vanity Fair, who's done really terrific reporting on the potential origins of COVID-19. Welcome, Katherine.
Thanks for having me. Great to be on with you.
So you were among the early reporters of some of the potential conflicts of interest in which the NIH would have maybe been reticent to fully investigate a lab leak hypothesis. You also did some great reporting on what intelligence we've gathered, what information we've gathered about what was actually going on in the Wuhan lab, and the pressure to produce experimentation, whether it led to cutting of corners. So I think you're a perfect person to have on to discuss this. What was your takeaway from the hearings and from the kind of shifting consensus, which is now being much more open to the possibility of a lab leak?
Well, first of all, it's important to say that this hearing was a long time in coming. There has been a sort of political standoff and a scientific standoff around the question of origins. And so this is really one of the very first hearings that looked squarely at this issue. I think part of the Democratic reluctance to hold hearings on this is that the Republicans have really targeted Anthony Fauci. And so the entire debate has become really, unfortunately, politicized in a way that I think has been very counterproductive in exploring the very serious questions that exist.
Yeah, speaking on the politicization front, we've heard, I've seen kind of commentators in the media, in the mainstream media, who are now saying, okay, yes, the lab leak should be explored and investigated, but I was hesitant. They'll say that they were hesitant to open the door to that because of the perception that it was somehow tied to something Donald Trump thought, or that it was somehow the more racially problematic of the theories. I think that's that seemed like a knee-jerk kind of appraisal of those two theories to me anyway. It doesn't really make sense, and shows, I guess, the risk of having the pursuit of truth be so hamstrung by politics.
This has just been really a toxic debate from the very beginning. President Trump got up in April of 2020 and said it came from the lab. He did not provide evidence. From my own reporting, it's clear that some of what is viewed by some as stronger evidence came in much later than that. So it is really not clear what the basis of that early claim he made was, but it certainly set the stage for an extreme reluctance by many within the government and outside of it to even take this possibility seriously. Unfortunately, because of that, the clues or the material has come out drip by drip through sort of armchair sleuths, through a few journalists, through FOIA groups who have been litigating against the NIH. And what has emerged from internal emails is a picture of an NIH that quickly seemed to understand that it had some exposure here. That is not to say that the NIH played necessarily any role in funding the research that ultimately may have led to a laboratory leak, but it is clear that the NIH did provide funding that went to the Wuhan Institute of Virology for risky coronavirus research, and that has really complicated the investigative picture here.
Katherine, can you speak to some of the evidence that was presented at the hearings from the pro-zoonotic camp versus the lab leak camp? Because so much of this conversation is about, you know, stigma and bias and premature claims and cover-ups. But for people who just want to be able to figure out what really happened, what kind of evidence are we looking at?
Well, first of all, let me just say, there are a number of virologists who have made the point that there were no virologists on the panel yesterday. That is true, and I think that's unfortunate. So we really did not get to hear from the scientists in the virology community who have advocated that this and studied and come up with a conclusion that there was a natural origin for this virus and it came from a market. So unfortunately, that viewpoint was not very well represented at the hearing yesterday. But the viewpoint that was represented was the people putting forth the evidence that it possibly could have come from a laboratory. So one of the things that they have talked about is the unusual features of this virus, that it contains a furin cleavage site, which is a genomic feature of the virus that allows it to sort of dock successfully in human cells and infect human cells. Now, why is that particularly alarming to some of the witnesses yesterday? Because in 2018, the Wuhan Institute of Virology's top coronavirus scientists, in partnership with a North Carolina virologist and a scientific nonprofit in the US, applied to DARPA, which is a DoD agency, to create coronavirus sequences with that exact feature in them. So they were proposing to do in 2018 what emerged in late 2019. You know, the witnesses yesterday pointed out that that alone is enough for us to be able to consider the possibility of a laboratory leak. You know, the witnesses also pointed out that the NIH really has not been forthcoming here about what kind of research they funded, you know, what the grant proposals were, whether they were funding extremely risky research, you know, and all of that took place about 8 miles away from the market where the virus first emerged.
And could you, you know, summarize for our viewers some of the reporting you've done on, you know, the lab procedures, the pressure to produce innovations, the dispatches from the Wuhan Institute of Virology that perhaps suggest a warning of something very bad that had happened that they were, you know, informing the government about?
Right. Well, the sources I've interviewed and the documents that I've obtained basically show that in the run-up to the emergence of the virus, the Wuhan Institute of Virology was struggling with its biocontainment procedures. It was making procurements that suggested there may have been some kind of issue that they were grappling with, some sort of biocontainment issue. And then there were archived documents suggesting that there were meetings related to biocontainment problems that occurred at the WIV. I think even more compellingly is the fact that, you know, their own directors and their own scientists were publishing papers in peer-reviewed journals saying that the, you know, regulation and the procedures around risky research were woefully inadequate. They did not have enough funding. They did not have enough trained and experienced staff. You know, there seemed to be a recognition in China that there was a need for regulatory overhaul of this risky research. And those top folks, including the scientist who ran the BSL-4 laboratory at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, were really sounding the alarm about some of these problems. You know, I should say, I think we don't know enough at this point to say where this virus originated. And that was really a major theme that emerged from yesterday's hearing. So there has been a call in Congress for the Biden administration to declassify what they do know. And I think that that could go a long way toward filling out the picture here.
Well, we want to play an exchange from the hearing yesterday. House Republican Jim Jordan had this to say.
Why don't you cut to the chase and tell them what you really think was the reason?
I don't know what the reason was.
I know what it was.
Go
ahead. I'll let you say it because I read your testimony. I think you said it in your testimony too. Maybe you're reluctant to say it here, but go ahead.
Well, if you're looking at the timeline, on May 21st, just a few weeks after the Nature Medicine article had come out, two of the signatories of the original email to Dr. Fauci, that's Dr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, were awarded a $9 million grant for the...
So there's 9 million reasons why they changed their mind. I knew you'd get to it. I read that last night. 3 months after, so 3 days after they say it came from a lab, they changed their position, and the only intervening event's a conference call with Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins. Again, a call that Mr. Redfield was not allowed to be on, the head of CDC and on the coronavirus task force. And then 3 months later, shazam, they get $9 million from Dr. Fauci.
So some of the, I think, concerning details to emerge in this hearing is that, and Dr. Redfield's testimony was very powerful, that he was not welcome in some of these conversations because of his advocacy or because of his idea that it was a lab leak. And also, you know, we're worried, can we trust government, science, health experts to properly vet and investigate COVID's origins when it does seem like they both had money at stake and almost something ideologically and a desire to avoid future bureaucratic scrutiny, right? Given their investment in the kinds of the research that we're now worried about.
So really what goes to the heart of the question here is why there appears to have been an effort to manufacture an early narrative that this could not have come from a laboratory. And really that narrative was manufactured long before scientific evidence had emerged, right? It was very early on, January, February, in which the question of a possible laboratory origin was branded as a conspiracy theory. And that was done in a series of papers. And in the paper that Jordan is referring to there was called Proximal Origins. It was really put together in February of 2020 by a group of scientists who had, background conversations with Dr. Fauci and Jeremy Farrar of the Wellcome Trust in the UK. And the question there has been, why did they, the scientists who were involved said early on, privately in emails to one another, that it looked to them like it possibly could have come from a laboratory, that it could have been an engineered virus. Within days, they changed their stance and put together a paper which really took the possibility of a laboratory leak off the table. And so one of the questions is, why did that happen? Did it happen on the basis of some scientific evidence that they got a hold of so quickly, or did it happen on the basis of a decision that a narrative of a laboratory leak would be so damaging to science, to the NIH, to international harmony, which one of the emails references, that they wanted to kind of put that possibility to bed as quickly as possible?
Katherine, thank you so much for joining us to go over that. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.